Welcome to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's White Sturgeon Recreational Fishery informational meeting. My name is, Jonathan Nelson. I am a program manager in our Fisheries Branch, anadromous fisheries program. And joining me today for our presentation is Dr. John Kelly and Colby House, and they will be also they are our sturgeon specialists that work in Fisheries Branch, and they're going to be helping us out today as they go through the majority of the presentation. So the presentation is likely going to take around 45 minutes. We're going to go over the biology of the white sturgeon. We're going to talk about the history of the fishery, our current monitoring programs, what we know about the population status, some details from the harmful algal bloom that occurred last summer, the future of the fishery, talk about an angler survey that we're going to be putting out. Note that this meeting is being recorded. There are not plans to host the meeting publicly. However, we will use the meeting to help us to capture all of our public comment for the transcript, so we don't miss any of that information. With that, I'm going to turn it over to John, and he's going to kick us off in our presentation.
All right, thank you. My name is John Kelly. I'm the sturgeon coordinator for CDFW and Fisheries Branch. And I know that a number of people on this Zoom call are familiar with sturgeon or even sturgeon experts, but I also assume that there are people listening in who may be less familiar. So we're going to start off with some general biology of sturgeon, focus a bit on white sturgeon, and then we'll get into talking about the fishery and some of those topics. And I want to start off by pointing out how very different sturgeon are from a lot of the things people fish for in this area. People familiar with salmon, rockfish, striped bass, halibut. Sturgeon are a very different animal, and we need to keep that in mind as we think about them, as we manage them and fish for them. So sturgeon are a really ancient lineage of fish. What I mean by that is that they, if you were to go back, say, 200 million years, to the coastal oceans in this area that eventually becomes California. And if you look into the oceans here, you would find fish that were recognizably like sturgeon. And put that into some comparison, you'd only have to go back 60 million years to find a Tyrannosaurus rex. So we're talking about an organism that's been here for a very long time. There are 25 species of sturgeon that are found worldwide, all of them north of the equator. We have 8 of them in the United States. It's worth pointing out, too, that all of those species worldwide are considered at some risk of extinction. Some are at extremely high levels of risk. Others maybe a little bit less so, but they're definitely considered an organism, a group of organisms that we need to keep an eye on. So all species of sturgeon have some similarities, right? They're very large fish. They have this long kind of elongated body form, kind of torpedo-shaped. They have these large, heavy, very stiff pectoral fins down low on the body, down towards the front. The dorsal fin is way towards the back. They have this very shark-like tail with a large upper lobe and a much smaller lower lobe. But unlike sharks, they are considered a bony fish. Right? So sharks don't have bone. They have cartilage throughout their body, whereas sturgeon do have bone, but they don't have a ton of it, mostly associated with these heavy armor plates up around the head. Their skeleton is actually largely cartilage and soft. They also don't have scales like we associate with modern fishes, but they do have lots of little bony plates in their skin, and some of them are kind of speckled and small all over their body. But then their most recognizable feature are probably these large diamond-shaped scutes that run along the side of the body, along the top, and then also along the bottom edges. Now, all sturgeon have these 4 dangling little barbels, these structures that are hanging off the front of their rostrum or snout. These are covered with taste receptors. So not just in their mouth, they can taste with these, and they also have some touch receptors, and they're using that to feel around on the bottom, taste around on the bottom, looking for food. Sturgeon also have electroreceptors. That are much like sharks have. So they can detect very weak electrical fields given off by living animals. And so they use that as well to try to find food as they're moving around on the bottom. So, and then additionally, sturgeon have a very unique mouth. It's very distinct from other fishes. They don't have teeth, but they have this long, this tube-like structure that they can stick out, and they can use that to suck up food items as they're moving around on the bottom. So as I said, there's 8 species in North America, but we have 2 in California and along the West Coast in general. Both of them are anadromous, meaning that they spend a lot of their time in salty water of some kind, and then they're moving up into freshwater, into rivers, where they're going to spawn and reproduce occasionally. So we have green sturgeon in California. That's pictures A and B are green sturgeon, and white sturgeon are pictures C and D. Now, if you handle them a lot, they're actually pretty easy to tell apart, but a lot of people, particularly anglers, don't see a lot of green sturgeon. They're not terribly common. And so they can be a little bit difficult. I hear a lot of advice about how to tell them apart. Some of it's not so good. So yeah, green sturgeon typically are greenish. They have this kind of olive drab, olivey color, but it can be very pale. It can almost be golden yellow. It can also be quite dark, almost black. Whereas white sturgeon are typically this grayish or silvery color along their back with a very pale white bottom. So that helps, but it's not ideal. They can look very similar color-wise. So one good clue, green sturgeon will always have this dark stripe on their ventral or bottom side. You can see it in this picture here. Now, it's not always this large or thick or bold or dark, but it's always there in some extent. Whereas if you look at the white sturgeon, it's absent entirely. It's completely pale. Sturgeon also typically have a stripe coming from the base of that pectoral fin. You can see it there. You can see it here on this one here. And you can see that it's completely missing on white sturgeon. So those are useful field marks, but if you really want to do it right, the best thing you can do is count these scutes along the side, these bony plates. Green sturgeon will always have less than 33. They usually have less than that, more like in the 25, 6, 27, something like that. Whereas white sturgeon will have more than 36. So if you count those scutes and you got 36 or more, you got yourself a race. Okay, we're not going to spend too much more time talking about green sturgeon. It's not the topic of this talk, but just real briefly, we find them along the West Coast from southern Alaska all through Canada, down along Washington, Oregon, and into California. And generally, we think of this as a much more marine-oriented fish, meaning they spend a lot of their time in saltwater in the coastal oceans. And they're just coming into bays and estuaries, maybe in the summers to feed, and then occasionally in rivers to spawn, but mostly in that marine water. Our historical records aren't great, but it looks like they were always less common than white sturgeon, lower abundance. It's certainly true now. In 2006, green sturgeon were listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act as threatened. And so now you can no longer fish for them in the United States, can't fish for them in California. By comparison, white sturgeon have a very similar range. You can see that here from, again, southern Alaska, down along Canada, down along the western coast. But we really think of these as more of an estuary and freshwater oriented fish. They're absolutely able to go out into the ocean. They do it sometimes, but they don't seem to do it very often. And they're really more associated with these very large river systems like the Fraser River, Columbia, Kootenai, Snake Rivers. And then we have the fish we're talking about today that are found in the Central Valley and the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. And so that appears to be one distinct population that's genetically separate from some of those other populations we find up north. As you can see from this range map, we do find reports of them in a number of coastal streams and rivers, large rivers, Klamath, Eel, things like that, or some of the coastal estuaries, but they're not very common. And they're mostly spending the majority of their time within that San Francisco Bay, Delta, estuary region, and then up into the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. White sturgeon are not protected as an endangered species under the federal or state Endangered Species Act, but they are considered a California species of special concern. It doesn't give them any automatic protections, but it does mean we consider them one of those species that is more at risk and we want to keep a closer eye on. And of course, as I think that most people or everyone here on this call knows, there's also a popular recreational fishery for this fish. So white sturgeon are pretty neat critters. Historically, they could have grown as maybe as long as 20 or more feet, weighing almost a ton, 1,800 pounds. Fish of that size would probably be over 100 years old. I'm not actually entirely sure where this picture came from. I've tried to sort it out, maybe from the Columbia River, but it's a nice example of a very large fish next to some humans for scale. And you can see this is quite a large white sturgeon here. I think it's worth pointing out this fish hanging above them is also a white sturgeon. It's probably at least 6 feet long. So that's actually a fish larger than you could legally keep in any Western state right now. And it's certainly dwarfed by this very large fish next to them. And for comparison, the silhouette is roughly what a 20-foot long fish would look like if you were to run into one. Quite an impressive animal if you were to see that. Now, it's unlikely we'll maybe see fish of that size again, but I'm happy to say there are large white sturgeon still around. This is just one example that I recently found caught on the Fraser River, and released. But so they are still present. These magnificent fish are still around. As I mentioned earlier, sturgeon are a very different animal from some of the other things we're familiar with. So I want to point some of those differences out. We got to pay attention to them as we manage this fish. While they can grow very, very large, obviously, they don't necessarily get there fast, right? They have a relatively slow growth rate for such a large fish. It's very tough to tell the age of a fish, by the way, and particularly in sturgeon, because they don't have a lot of hard parts. But one thing we can do is take a section out of this heavy fin ray, the first fin ray that we find on the pectoral fin. And if we do a cross section and kind of clean it up a bit, you can see these rings, right? And these are growth rings, just like you might find in a tree trunk. And each one equates to about a year of growth. And we can count those up and get an idea of how old that fish is versus how long it was. And so you can see on this figure here, for instance, we have age on the bottom. We have length, in this case, in centimeters on the left side. In California, you're allowed to keep fish between 40 inches and 60 inches in fork length. And so that means fish in our area are generally, when they enter that legal size, that slot limit, they're about 9 years old, and they stay inside that slot limit until they're about 17 years old before they age out, continue to grow, and become oversized and protected fish. In addition to growing slowly, they take a long time to mature, meaning that to get to that first age where they can reproduce, have babies, and start that next generation to keep the population going. So in California, in our population of fish, when fish are roughly about 14 years old, we find that about 50% of them are mature and able to spawn for at least the first time. And it's not until they're about 19 years old when we think pretty much all of them are mature. Now, different from salmon, sturgeon don't die after they spawn. They can spawn multiple times in their life, but they can't do it every year for the most part. It takes a lot of energy and to prepare, to spawn, to move upriver and do all that kind of stuff. And so there's a few years in between. Males seem to do it more frequently, generally probably every other year, whereas females take a little bit longer. All those eggs take a lot of energy to create. So females are spawning on average every 2 and 5 years. And so the fish that are going to migrate in any given year, they're generally living right here in the estuary, the bays, the delta, and they'll start moving up the main rivers, generally in the winter. So from December and then into May is the primary period where we see the spawning migration. And we believe the majority of the fish we're seeing in our population are spawning in this area between, say, Verona and Calusa. That seems to be the primary spawning habitat. We know of some spawning that takes place on the San Joaquin River down around roughly around the Modesto area. We also see large adult fish in the Feather, Yuba, Bear rivers, sometimes the Tuolumne River. It's not entirely clear why they're there. They're probably there to spawn, but until we actually see eggs or larvae, we can't confirm that. We haven't found that to date. When they do spawn, they're different from salmon as well. They don't create a nest or a redd. They just are what we call broadcast spawners. So they swim up into the water, into the current. Female releases the eggs, and the males next to her release sperm, and that mixes, fertilizes the eggs, and those fertilized eggs float a little bit downstream before they sink to the bottom. They're very sticky and adhesive, and so they stick to gravel and cobble and things like that, where they then start to develop. Development is actually pretty surprisingly fast. Within about a week or two, depending on water temperature, they've matured within the eggs and they hatch. And the early hatchlings look like these fish at the top, these larvae up at the top. You can see they don't really look like sturgeon yet. They don't have a lot of identifiable features, but they do have this very large yolk sac, which they are feeding off of and surviving on. And over a course of a few weeks, they're growing, absorbing that yolk sac. They eventually move to feeding for themselves as their mouth and their organs develop. And eventually they develop into small but recognizable sturgeon-like little juvenile. So where do we find them, and where are they doing this? Well, this is actually one. This is a white sturgeon larvae that was collected in the Delta in our tow net survey. So this is a fairly young fish. This fish probably spawned up by Calusa, and within a period of a week or so was moved down into the Delta, where it would continued rearing and growing on its own. So a lot of the stuff is happening in that Delta, that freshwater Delta region. Now, it's one thing for fish to spawn. They seem to do that every year, even in really low drought years. But it's another thing. We really need those fish to survive to make it into the adult population. And we call that recruitment. And recruitment doesn't seem to be very common. You can see this is an index year on the bottom. We have the fish that we're catching, the 1- and 2-year-old fish that we catch in some of our surveys. And you can see some years there's very high numbers of fish that are caught. Other years there's very low or even no fish that are caught. And if we overlay the amount of water that's flowing through the region, so the outflow in the Delta, that's what this line is, you can see that there's a very close correlation between high wet water years and high recruitment years. And then in years when there's low outflow, low water, very poor recruitment. And so definitely something we have to keep our eye on, again, as we're managing this fishery. We don't always have a good year of babies and offspring. Once they spawn, they don't seem to stay in the rivers too long. Most of them are going to move back down into that habitat, the Bay Delta area where they were inhabiting before, where they're going to start feeding. And recently, we've got some new evidence that they're not all the same. We seem to have some subgroups that are behaving different ways. We can take those fin rays I talked about earlier, and we can actually look at the minerals that were laid down in that bony fin ray over time, and that allows us to kind of tell where the fish was, what salinity it was during that time. And just as an example, I'm not going to go into this in too great detail, but you can see this blue. These are fish over a 10-year span that stayed in very fresh water, really never getting into salty water at all. So these are fish that probably were inhabiting this freshwater Delta for that entire time. Whereas we have some fish that seem to move into saltier water fairly quickly and then reside there for long periods of time. Like we find in this aqua color over here, probably in the bays. And then we have a couple of other intermediate strategies that seem to move in different ways. So we have to keep that in mind too as we manage the species. They're not all doing the same things in the same places, and we have to be aware of it. That's about it for some general biology. But I want to talk briefly about the history of the fishery before we talk about the modern fishery. This is actually an archival photo. I think it's pretty neat. This is from 1916 from CDFW archives. These are some fish that were caught commercially up in the Sacramento River in the Calusa region. Some nice fish these gentlemen have caught. People have certainly been fishing for sturgeon in this region for a very long time, but we don't really have very good records of it until after the gold rush, after European settlement in this area. And so our records really start in the 1860s when they're first monitored by the California Fish Commission, which came before the Fish and Game Commission and CDFW. And there was a brief period for a few decades of an active commercial fishery where a lot of fish were landed. You can see over this period, including a few years, quite heavy landings. It's worth pointing out, white sturgeon were never considered a high quality food item, but people still caught them and consumed them. But by the turn of the century, by 1901, numbers had declined so significantly, the catch was so poor that the fishery was actually closed by the state. And it remained closed to about 1909, where it was opened experimentally, but the numbers were so low and catch was so poor that by 1917, it was closed again. And it remains closed. So the commercial fishery is never reopened. And there's no commercial fishing allowed for sturgeon in California now. As for the recreational fishery, by 1954, numbers the population had rebounded sufficiently that the fishery was reopened. At that time, we didn't manage the two species separately, so green and white sturgeon were considered together. And you're able to go out and catch one fish per day over 40 inches total length, and as many as you wanted per year. That minimum size limit kind of fluctuated a couple of times over the years as managers were trying to maintain those populations. But by the time we get to 1990, we institute for the first time a maximum size limit at the time of 72 inches total length. This is actually the first slot limit used in California on any fish. And so the point of this is to protect the youngest fish, give them some chance to survive and spawn, and protect the biggest fish that produce the most babies and are the most valuable for reproducing. And so that starts in 1990. And over a period of time, the minimum size was raised slightly to protect the very youngest fish. In 2006, as I said, green sturgeon were federally listed as threatened. And so in 2007, the state responded by shutting down the green sturgeon fishery entirely. You're no longer allowed to fish for them, land them, or handle them. At the same time, we instituted some white sturgeon regulations as well. We decreased the maximum size down to 66 inches total length. And I just want to point out for those who don't do this regularly, right? Total length is that distance from the tip of the snout to the very tip of the tail. This is also the time where we started the sturgeon fishing report card program so that we could collect better data on how many people were going out, how many fish were being kept, how many fish were being released. It's really useful information for us, and we'll talk about that in more detail soon. And we also instituted a maximum limit of 3 fish per year and still 1 fish per day. So that pretty much brings us up to present. 2013 was the last major regulation change. One thing that was done is our size limit changed from total length to fork length. That's measuring to the fork of the tail. This is a 40 to 60 inch fork length. It's actually the same size fish as we had before, the 46 to 66 total length, just accounting for that different measuring way to measure. And the reason that this was done is because the total length can be a little tricky. The tip of the tail can get damaged or shortened for a number of reasons, whereas the fork length is a more reliable and stable measure to use. We also prevent people now from taking fish larger than 68 inches out of the water to protect those largest spawning fish from harm, from injury. We require single barbless hooks, no snares and gaffs. We also have some very small closures. You can't fish for sturgeon above the Highway 162 bridge on the Sacramento River, and also a small part of central San Francisco Bay. These are both put in place to protect green sturgeon, but also apply to white sturgeon. And just for frame of reference, because we find white sturgeon in other Western states, and they're also managed in their some fisheries, we want to take a look at how other states do it. So in Washington, Oregon, mostly co-manage their fish because the Columbia River is a shared border. Most of their fishing for sturgeon is catch and release only. They do permit some harvest, and it's very specific. They open up particular reaches for harvest, and they only do it on certain days. So for instance, last year, there were 3 days in September, 12 days in May and June, and you could only fish from dawn until 2 p.m. They also use a much smaller slot limit, 44 to 50 inches than we do. And all of that can be varied annually based on their monitoring, depending on if the population they feel is doing well or is struggling. And then also there's a fishery in Idaho, but that is catch and release only. There's no harvest permitted there at all. I'm going to stop talking and pass the presentation over to my colleague Colby.
Thanks, John. Hi again, my name is Colby House. I'm an environmental scientist in the Anagmas program out of Fisheries Branch. And yeah, like John said, I'm just going to run through our monitoring programs and talk about the information on the fishery and the population that we gain from those programs. And so our long-running program to monitor population dynamics of white sturgeon is our mark recapture or tagging program. The program began more consistent sampling in the 1980s, but has only been occurring annually since 2005. And so each year we go out from August to October, and nets are deployed to catch a wide range of sizes of sturgeon. Any sturgeon caught gets a pit tag, which is a small internal tag that reads like a barcode when scanned, but only legal slot size, so that 50 to 60 inch slot. White sturgeon get tagged with an external reward tag, which is pictured in the center. Those reward tags currently range from $50 to $150. And the goal is to release those fish back into the system, allow them to mix into the population, and then become recaptured by anglers in the recreational fishery. Those anglers then in turn send those tags back into the department and receive the reward equal to that monetary value on the tag. And then we get that really critical data point because the basis of our population abundance and harvest rate estimates uses that ratio of tags released out into the system and then tags returned back to us. Next slide. The Sturgeon Report Card Program is another program that informs our population monitoring, but it also serves as our best data source to track trends in the fishery. And so if you're fishing for white sturgeon, you're required to purchase the Sturgeon Report Card and have it in your possession while fishing for sturgeon. And if you catch a sturgeon, all anglers are required to record the date, the length, in fork length, the species, so green or white, the location the sturgeon was caught, and the map to the right shows some location codes spatially. And if the fish was kept and harvested or released, and then also the disc tag number if it is present on the fish. And then all those cards are due back to the department by January 30th of the following year. So if you scan the QR code on the left, this is going to direct you to the Sturgeon Report Card webpage. Now, this is a really good resource for answering pretty much any question related to the fishery. We keep up-to-date regulations posted. We have instructions on how to report your sturgeon card, how to replace a lost or stolen card, how to return a reward tag, and additional data summaries. And we also post a link to our annual technical report for the sturgeon card data. And so having this information easily accessible to folks is really important to us. As you can see on the figure to the right, we sell a high volume of report cards to anglers each year, averaging around 45,000 a year. That's this gray dashed line. But we only receive about 31% of those cards returned back to us, the black solid line. And you see those trends start to stabilize out in 2013. That is when a card fee was implemented. So prior to that year, the cards were provided free of charge. And so what this means, thanks, John. What this means is that we just don't have information on those 70% of anglers that don't return their report cards. This 30% may be representative of the fishery when we're looking at trend averages over years, but it's likely biasing our harvest and catch numbers low, which can impact our population monitoring. Okay, now we can go to the next slide, thanks. So the next few slides, I'm just gonna go through some trends in the fishery that we're able to track through our report card monitoring. The figure on the right shows average annual percent of reported catch per month. Those black points are average catch across all years for that month. And those vertical lines just describe the variation in the individual data points to that average value. So the overall trend is that we can see higher catch in the fall and spring, and this coincides with the timing of upstream spawning movements into the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta and lower rivers. And lowest catch typically occurs in the summer months. And I just want to note that the Sturgeon Report Card does not collect data on how much effort, or in other words, how often people are fishing or trips taken. So this trend is not taking that into account, and therefore we cannot say if low catch in the summer, for example, is due to less fishing effort, maybe anglers are targeting other species, or if that lower catch is because white sturgeon are not as active or available for catch in the areas where people are typically fishing. Next slide. So here we're looking at annual trends in reported total catch, total released catch, and total capped catch or harvest over time. And we see overall general declining trends across all three of these categories. So looking at that top solid line on the graph, we see that total catch reached a high in 2015 with 8,600 white sturgeon reported caught, which has declined to a low of 3,600 fish in 2022. And that middle line is showing our release catch over time, which also was reported at a high of 6,200 fish in 2015 and a low of 2,000 released fish in 2021. And then that bottom dashed line shows harvested catch over time. And in 2017, there was a reported 2,800 white sturgeon harvested, which has declined to 1,300 in 2022. So as we are seeing these declines in total reported catch over time, we're also seeing a higher proportion of that total catch harvested versus released. So this graph to the right, the dark gray bars are representing the percent of the reported catch that is harvested or kept, which is increasing over time, versus the light gray bars, which represents the percent of reported catch that is released, which is declining over time. And so what we're taking away from this is that anglers are reporting catching fewer and fewer fish over time, but are harvesting more of those fish relative to the total amount caught. Next slide. And from our data, we cannot make definitive statements on trends in anglers strictly practicing catch and release fishing, but we think a pretty good metric for that is looking at trends in anglers that report releasing all sturgeon caught and therefore retaining none. And so this figure on the right is, those points are representing that. We see a declining trend in the anglers reporting catching sturgeon, but retaining no fish caught, which just supports this general trend of anglers choosing to release fewer fish over time. Slide. So this harvest information from report cards and our tag recapture information from our Mark Recapture program, these data sources are extremely important because we integrate them to calculate two important metrics that help us monitor the population, including legal sized abundance. So that's the number of fish that are within that legal 40 to 60 inch slot range, and then harvest rate or exploitation rate. I'll use those interchangeably as I go. And this is just the percent of those total legal size fish that are removed from the population through fishing. Next slide. So our abundance monitoring shows general long-term pattern of decline. On this vertical axis to the left, those are abundance estimates with year on the horizontal axis. And I just want you all to pay attention to the opening closed points on the plot. Those are representing the average abundance estimate for that year. And we see this general trend in decreasing abundance, especially in the last few decades. So our recent estimate is around 33,000 legal or slot-sized white sturgeon. And this is decreased from our previous estimate in 2015, which was around 48,000 slot-sized fish. Next slide. Estimates of exploitation rate have varied over time, but overall remain above the recommended sustainable level for sturgeon species. The figure on the right shows estimates of harvest rate from a study conducted in 2019 by Blackburn et al., where she calculated harvest rates across the 9-year period, which range from 8 to around 30%, with an average of 13.6% over that time period. Our current 5-year average is around 8%. And these are comparatively high harvest rates. For context, Washington and Oregon set a 4% targeted harvest rate. In Idaho, there's no harvest. It's strictly a catch and release fishery. Next slide. So harvest is really the only source of mortality that we've been able to somewhat reliably track over time, but we know that there are many other threats that sturgeon face that we cannot easily measure, one of those being ship strikes. So the pictures on the right are from a collaborative effort to better document sturgeon mortality from large vessel strikes. And so we're talking about big commercial ships, not small recreational boats. Next slide. Poaching is also a big problem. White sturgeon are highly prized for their caviar, and there's a really active black market for it in California. So poaching has become increasingly problematic as this market has grown. Next slide. And then there's predation, and while sea lion predation seems to be more of a problem in other systems like the Columbia Basin, there have been reports of this occurring in the San Francisco estuary and Delta, but to what extent we just have not been able to measure. Next slide. Pumps and diversions. California's water system is highly modified, and sturgeon can become trapped in these water operation facilities, which poses a very serious threat to survival, especially at younger life stages when they are most vulnerable. And then more recently, harmful algal blooms, or HABs, as we'll refer to them throughout the remainder of the presentation. These can have catastrophic impacts on fish communities in general, and more recently has been the cause of a mass mortality event for sturgeon in the San Francisco estuary and bays. So I will pass it back to John to discuss this event in a little bit more detail.
All right, thank you, Colby. Okay, so advance my slides. So harmful algal blooms have been around in the area, but they really seem to be more of a recent concern for us. They've occurred, but they hadn't been so large. But this last summer, in 2002, we experienced a significant event caused by this one particular organism, Heterosigma kashiwa. This picture on the bottom is San Pablo Bay, taken in late August. The water was visibly discolored and very murky and just looked very different from the way it's supposed to look. So H. kashiwa is a marine phytoflagellate, so I guess it's not actually a true algae, but I'll leave that to the botanists to explain. It is a photosynthetic single-celled organism, though. It's actually found around the world. It's very common, widely distributed. It has a very broad range of conditions it can tolerate. It's found, I think, between around 11 and 24 degrees Celsius, and from full strength seawater down to about 5 parts per thousand. So that's fairly fresh. It's not particularly salty. In most cases, doesn't cause a lot of problems, but if it proliferates and has a big bloom, it can actually lead to fish kills, and that's what we have on this illustration here. Each red mark indicates a site of a fish kill caused that's traced back to this particular organism. I think I just noticed a hand go up, and if it's okay, we're going to wait and take questions and comments at the end, rather than get rid of it right here, if that's okay. So, this organism is, like I said, it's very common. It's found all over the place. And frankly, in most cases, it's just simply dormant in sediment. It's not doing much of anything. But under the right conditions, it can explode into very large numbers over a very short period of time. And that includes, they need fertilizer, basically. They need ammonium or nitrate or urea, these nitrogen compounds, just like terrestrial plants, they require that to grow. It also requires the right combination of warmer temperatures and just the right salinities to really kind of go crazy. And this leads to a couple of different problems. It can be very dangerous or lethal to fish because of one, just large numbers of this organism tends to irritate the gills, produces a lot of mucus. That makes it tough for the fish to extract oxygen out of the water with their gills, so can lead to suffocation that way. Also, when this organism is stressed, it produces a number of very potent toxins that are lethal to fish, so it can kill fish directly that way. And additionally, when you have huge numbers of these single cells growing and then quickly dying and dropping to the bottom, and they start to decompose, they can remove large amounts of the oxygen from the environment, and you get very low dissolved oxygen. Fish need oxygen to breathe, just like we do. And so that can also lead to fish kills. So there's a number of different mechanisms that can cause problems when we have one of these blooms. So here's what happened in our area this last summer. The images are satellite images that are showing, that allow us to basically track where algae is in water. And you can read this by the cooler colors, blue and the light greens, mean less algae. And as we go into warmer colors, yellows, oranges, and reds, we have much higher concentrations. Okay. So here we are, beginning of August 7th. And you can see the start of this harmful algal bloom off of Alameda Harbor. Quite a focused concentration right there. Over a period of a couple of weeks, it spreads throughout the system. We see that main plume moving out well into the more central parts of South Bay. But we also just see elevated levels throughout the system and including up into San Pablo Bay as well. So that's August 20th. By within a week, things have really exploded, right? We see very extreme conditions throughout the entire region, South Bay, but also San Pablo Bay. And this is the period of time where we start to get a lot of reports of fish kills, of fish carcasses showing up. Within a week, some of the actual numbers of algae seem to be declining somewhat, but there's still some significant concentrations, especially in San Pablo. But we also now see system-wide decreases in dissolved oxygen, as I was describing, with these decomposing algae are now driving down the oxygen and causing lethal or harmful conditions to fish. Within another week, we basically have returned to pretty close to baseline, right? We see very low levels throughout the system, dissolved oxygen has recovered. So we have a very intense month where a lot happens and a very serious exposure throughout this entire system. So what was going on then? I think we all remember it was a pretty warm summer last year, particularly in August. We had a pretty intense heat wave and just elevated temperatures for a long period of time. That was coinciding with this event. It was really, remember throughout the entire Western U.S., but very heavily throughout the Central Valley and the Bay Delta regions that we're focusing on now. This also, of course, was following on several years of very serious drought, severe, exceptional drought throughout the entire state, including, again, this area. So, all right, that means there's not a lot of rain or snow that was coming down, feeding those rivers, coming down into the delta and flushing and flowing through the bay and carrying stuff with it out to the ocean. And we can see that here, if we look at the delta outflows, the amount of water that's moving out through the delta measured in cubic feet per second. This period in kind of pinkish color here, this is the period of the harmful algal bloom that I just showed you those images of. And you can see the flow is low throughout this entire period, with the lowest values below 2,000 cubic feet per second. That's really not a lot of water. Compare that to a few years before in a wet year in 2017. The pink is the exact same time period. And you can see much higher amounts of water moving through the delta as a whole. The lowest levels around 9,000 cubic feet per second, and often quite a bit more than that. So very different conditions, a lot more flushing going on during this time. So what did this mean? Well, we all know. It meant a fish kill, a very significant one, the largest one ever recorded in San Francisco Bay. It hit a lot of different species. Yellowfin goby, we see here on the right, and Lake Merritt region in general was hit very hard. But also striped bass, bat rays, a number of other different species, and of course, unfortunately, a large number of sturgeon. So this was an unexpected event, right? We had no warning, we didn't expect it. We've never had anything of the size happen in our area. And so a number of different organizations and groups were scrambling to respond. We got a lot of useful and beneficial data from the public who were participating in data collection. So for instance, there's a site, iNaturalist, where people can post interesting animals that they see, and they started getting large numbers of reports of dead sturgeon showing up on this site. Additionally, the San Francisco Estuary Institute opened up an online portal so people could report carcasses there. There has been an ongoing, fairly long-running organization study of mortalities, looking for carcasses throughout the area. This is mostly focused on things like ship strikes in the past, but people started reporting large numbers of carcasses to this group. And then, of course, the department, we actually went out ourselves and started monitoring both the shoreline and boat-based surveys, trying to record and measure as much as we could. This all had to be ramped up very quickly on very short notice. And what this meant was we had a lot of data coming in from a lot of different places. Some were scientists, some were not, some were the public. And so we then had to spend a lot of time going through that and making sure that we weren't counting the same fish multiple times, that someone didn't report it to iNaturalist, and the mortality study, and maybe one of our crews also saw the same carcass. So we had to comb through all these pictures and locations, and often that involved calling people and getting more details so we could clean up this data set and get a better idea of what we actually experienced in the area. And unfortunately, it's not very pleasant to see. We can account for 864 sturgeon carcasses that should not be duplicates of that. 195 are confirmed to be white sturgeon by experts, 117 confirmed to be green sturgeon. The remaining 652 were either too decomposed or too partial to get a positive species ID, but for the very large part, these are mostly white sturgeon, just based on their biology, where they are, and our understanding of the species. The distribution of these carcasses was pretty much what we saw in those maps I showed you earlier of the bloom itself, right? Throughout the San Francisco Bays area, San Pablo. This figure illustrates a few points that we had to deal with. One, you'll note that there's some points on land. This is a case of some of those public reported carcasses. The locations that were being reported, maybe their home rather than where the carcass was. So we had to go and contact people, call people, get more information to clean this up so we could really tell where fish were. It took a bit of time. Another thing worth pointing out too, though, is in addition to a lot of impacts within the bay, we did see carcasses out along the coast outside of the bay, including particularly green sturgeon carcasses. This suggests to us that the mortality, the death we saw from this algal bloom wasn't just from low oxygen. Some fish survived, were able to swim out of the bay, but were probably too impacted from those toxins. So a number of different ways that fish were impacted by this thing. So when we look at what was out there, when we were able to, we got measurements of those fish. Like I said, not all of them were complete carcasses. Things decompose pretty quickly during that heat wave when they're sitting on the shore in the sun. And we didn't always have reports from scientists and people who had, were able to take measurements. But for the ones that we were able to measure and get good numbers on, 115 fish, we saw that alarmingly, these were largely large fish that were being reported. This left dotted line indicates the lowest size of our legal size slot limit. So 86% of the fish, the carcasses that were recorded, were larger than that minimum size. 30% were larger than the maximum size we allow people to keep. So these are the oversized fish. These are all generally adult fish, and particularly adult fish that we'd really like to keep in the population as breeding, spawning fish. So, this was an unfortunate event for sure. So what we know from this is it was large scales throughout that entire San Francisco Bay region. It wasn't just very localized harbor. We do, however, know that our sampling wasn't perfect. As I said, we had to ramp this up quickly. And you can see on this figure, for instance, there's patches of shoreline where there's no reports of carcasses. That's almost certainly not because there were no carcasses there, but simply because they were either private land or places that are simply too hard for people, often the public, remember, making these reports, for people to get out and look. So hopefully, if in the unfortunate event that this happens again, we'll be able to respond a little faster and a little more completely. But what this does mean is we definitely have an undercount of what was out there. We do know, as I said, that large and adult fish were heavily impacted. What we unfortunately really don't know the magnitude of this completely, because based on this, but also based on other fish kills and other evidence, science evidence that we have, sturgeon don't float very long, if at all. Many of them just plain sink. And so we only counted the ones that lasted long enough, floated long enough to get to the shore and be counted, or be counted by a boat survey, and that didn't decompose before someone got there. So it's very likely that this mortality event was more significant, quite a bit more significant than we were able to measure. With that, I'm going to return this over to John Nelson.
Thanks, John and Colby. I'm going to close out the presentation now just to talk about how we're going to move forward in this fishery, what the department thinks we need to do, because our goal is to continue to maintain a fishery that can have sustainable harvest for future generations. But what we've seen and what the data the trends that we're seeing, the potential impacts from this bloom, the population cannot continue to support our current harvest rates. As we went through today, the life history, these fish are slow growing, they're late to mature, they live a long time, and they have infrequent successful recruitment. This recent mortality event warrants additional protective measures. The actual loss, as John just pointed out, is likely higher than observed. And there is a risk that future generations could be greatly impacted by the loss of such a large component of mature adult spawning adults. And also, angler success has greatly improved. The technology and our access to learn how to fish and find where fish are in a quick manner through social media has greatly increased the ability of anglers to locate and catch sturgeon. And that even being said, we see the trend, the catch trend moving down, and we know that angler success is generally better. So that's also telling us that we are likely seeing a downward trend in the population size, or at least the harvestable size. So moving forward, the fishery will need to be managed for an annual harvest target based on abundance estimates. And we need to be more in line with a harvest rate on an annual basis that would allow us to continue to allow some level of harvest. Next slide. So on top of that, part of that is getting better access to data and implementing more surveys. And so we need the angling community to increase their return for report cards and disc tags. We really need those disc tags on an annual basis because that helps us to make our annual abundance estimates. So holding on to those tags for years that we're never returning them, or returning them 5 years later, actually is less helpful in the moment. Obviously that data still is important, but we really are hoping if those are caught within the year that they get returned, hopefully within that year that they're caught. Also, the department needs to step up our fishery independent surveys, and combined with those angler provided data, we think we can get a much more robust either estimate of the slot limit abundance or potentially the whole population, which currently we are unable to make full population level estimates because we're not able to, we're understaffed, we're underfunded, we're across the landscape currently. And so Fisheries Branch is working to try to allocate and find more resources to bolster our own surveys. And so we don't have to rely as heavily on angler supported data, which doesn't come back in the quantity that we really need to be able to make the management decisions that we need to make. So moving forward, and we have a team that we've been working with internally, we're going to do an evaluation of the future regulations. We're going to consider different aspects of those regulations and of the fishery. And those will include seasonal geographic closures, potentially catch and release and harvest seasons, bag limits, slot limit range, and a potential harvest quota system. None of these things are proposed at this point, but we will be coming up with a suite of options and recommendations. Our goal is to establish new regulations for 2025 if we can move through the process over the next year and a half. We will continue to get public input through an angler survey, which I'll talk about on the next slide, and through our Fish and Game Commission meeting process. And we may also be able to host a few more public meetings like this as we work through different aspects of the regulation process. The other thing that's come to light as we've moved through this is that interim emergency regulations for a catch and release only fishery may be needed until harvest rates can be effectively managed with new regulations. And so that's something the department's exploring over the next several months to see if that's something that we need to do so we don't continue to potentially over harvest fish until we can get new regulations in place. Next slide. So the department's put together an angler preference survey. We're hoping that it will go live in the next few days by the end of the week. It will be available in 8 languages. It will come through email to fishing license holders. It will be posted on our social media, and it will be posted to our department sturgeon webpage. It'll be a link similar to the striped bass survey, where it'll take you through a series of questions about the fishery and preferences about those fisheries. So we encourage everyone who receives the survey to take a few minutes to complete it. Currently, we're going to have the survey open through August 15th. We're going to see what kind of response we get, and we may extend it if needed. If there are any questions about the survey or today's presentation, or just sturgeon information in general, we do have a sturgeon email, and you can hit it up at sturgeon@wildlife.ca.gov.